Wigwusan, Tawama Kanitampa, Askata Squamson. Neesu Wushuwunoag, Director General, the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. If you've been following, you saw that we recently, the Executive Council passed a resolution to formally change the name of the institution from the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of America to the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas, to better reflect really what the goal and intent is of all the work that we're doing here, and really where our jurisdiction, creator willing, eventually will reach to. We're looking to reach out and touch base with all of the indigenous nations, wherever they're Aboriginal to, particularly here in the Americas, and that's north, south, and all in between. So it's wonderful to be here today. Haven't been back for a while. I only like to try to come on here when I have something of substance to share. And I felt that today's discussion would be of interest, particularly as individuals, starting to see more of them actually understanding the importance of knowing who their bloodlines are and where they tie to, and getting away from sort of this pan-American or pan-Aboriginal mindset. So much honor to everyone out there who's finding out who they are, and hopefully what I share today will help you get a few steps further along in your journey. And the topic of discussion today is going to be something that is very, very key, particularly when you're talking to being a pre-colonial nation, particularly when you're talking about claims to lands and having a superior one than the U.S., and that is the terms of conquest and subjugation. Conquest and subjugation. And these are very interesting because these are the basic laws and tenets that they argue why they have possession of these lands, right? They took them through conquest. And it's interesting because once you understand this concept, then you start to see why certain policies are put into place. It's going to tie into what we discussed with Snyder Act and all of that sort of good stuff, the Indian Citizenship Act. If you haven't checked out those videos, they're up on our YouTube page, so please check them out. But conquest and subjugation. And I'm going to start with a few definitions, just so you can understand this. And the first one, it says it applies to feudal law. Now, what is feudal law? Well, this applies to feudalism. And feudalism is the combination of legal and military customs that were used in medieval Europe. So this is during that time period. And of course, this is the mindset that they're coming over into these lands called the Americas with. They're dealing from a feudal mindset. And conquest under feudal law is acquisition by purchase and method of acquiring the ownership of a state other than by descent. So other than by descent, other than that this is your father's land, another way to acquire possession of that estate, also an estate acquired otherwise than by inheritance. So if you can see, descent and inheritance are the basics, and conquest is doing something outside of that. So that says that descent and inheritance, i.e. bloodlines and genealogy and all that, are really the baseline for any claims to any land when you're talking estates or inheritances. So that's the definition of conquest under feudal law. And remember, this is what the European was coming over here with, operating under these laws when they were conquesting, attacking, doing all of the things they were doing here. So this should add some understanding to you why they treated the indigenous populations in the manner that they did. They were trying to conquest them. So keep that in mind. Let's look at this second definition, and this one's under international law, and this comes from Britannica, Encyclopedia Britannica. But on international law, conquest is the acquisition of territory through force, especially by a victorious state, in a war at the expense of a defeated state. So that's the first thing. So they're saying they came over here and they fought us and they won. So they have conquested us. But the definition goes on further. It says an effective conquest. Now this is where their word games come in. So you have a conquest, but then you have an effective conquest. And what is the effective conquest? Well, this takes place when physical appropriation of territory, which is what they call annexation. So when they come and physically take your land from you, They're saying they annexed it from you. They've come and physically taken. So when your land is not only annexed, but it's also followed by subjugation. So keep in mind, conquest requires two elements under international law. Annexation, which is physical taking of the land, followed by subjugation, which is the legal process of transferring title. So conquest is not effective unless the land has been both annexed and subjugated. Now, let's look at this from the standpoint of European conquistadors, European colonialists, whatever you want to call them. They're coming over here with this feudal mindset. They're going to conquest the land. They conquest the land. They physically take it. But here's the question. Do they actually subjugate the land? And this should be the question when you're talking U.S. and U.S. relationship and what the importance is of going pre-colonial. Because if you notice, when they took the land from the indigenous populations here, initially they were engaging in treaties with them. These treaties are going to be their legal sort of documentation under their law of conquest to show that it was an effective conquest. Something on paper showing that this nation has agreed that you've bested it and that it's transferring title over to you if you're conquest. Other than that, the treaties are also relationships and agreements between the nations when they were both powerful in regarding what the terms of the relationship were to these lands and who was the superior entity. Whatever the case may be, a treaty is a contract, and treaty are one of the ways that they were showing an effective conquest when they were taking the land. So if you notice, as the U.S., and I'm talking U.S., I'm not talking colonial now, let's start with the U.S., 76 or later, as they're conquesting, they're forcing all of the Indian nations to sign treaties with them because they understand that under the international law, they need to have, for it to be an effective conquest, proof of subjugation. Proof of subjugation. So when you look at all of these tribes and they talk about treaty rights and all that, that's what a lot of them are hearkening back to. The fact that there is an agreement that we had. We had a fight. U.S., you bested us. We signed a treaty with you. Or we were deferring to the fact that if we fight with you, we're going to lose. So we'll sign these treaties and we'll abide by the agreements of the treaties. This was them showing effective conquest. Let's go pre-colonial. Let's go back to when the nations were signing treaties and whatnot with the actual colonial entities who were nothing more than representatives of the British Crown, of the Dutch Crown, of the French Crown, of the Spanish Crown. That's what the colonies were. So these treaties were tying back, or these relationships or these contracts were tying back to the kingdoms back there, and the initial ones were not about conquest. They were about the relationship with Europeans to this land and them having permission to even be operating over here in the first place. So these initial treaties were not about conquest. Eventually they became about conquest when they got more powerful, more guns, more Indians were killed off, more Indians were infighting. Then the treaties became about conquest, but they were still treaties. They were still official agreements between the Indian nations and the crown. Then we get the American Revolution, right? So the American Revolution is the U.S. Now saying we're no longer underneath the crown. We're a separate nation from the crown. We're going to be separate from them. While the British Crown may be able to claim conquest over these tribes, the U.S. cannot at this time, not in any different form or fashion than what the British Crown did, because they have not, this U.S., this new entity, has not formalized any relationships that it has with any of the Indian tribes here. They're still under the agreements that the Indian tribes originally had with the British Crown. So all of the treaties that were going on back then are still in effect. So what does the U.S. do? They break away from the British Crown, but they're now surrounded by all of these hostile nations that they realize, based upon the language that's in these treaties, the lands are still the Indians, the resources and mineral rights are still the Indians, all of these things are still the Indians. But that's not what the Americans want. They don't want to honor those. So here comes the whole racial misclassification element. Because if these nations no longer exist, then you don't have to worry about anyone arguing about an ineffective conquest. If there's no Nahigansis around, if there's no Pokanokets around, if there's no more power, whatever the case may be, then no one has a right to claim that the conquest was not effective. And once again, subjugation entails the legal process of transferring title, especially when you get up in here into the King Philip War territories, New England. You're going to find that most of the land transfers were totally unlawful, ab initio, from the beginning. They did twig and turf ceremonies, which is where someone breaks a twig off of a tree, picks up a cloud of dirt from the earth, and passes it on to the new owner of the land. The problem is there weren't any Indians involved in these twig and turf ceremonies, and definitely not any Indians that had any authority to be transferring any lands over. Really what it was they brought over the rich sort of barons or representatives of them from over in England, and they did the twig and turf ceremonies, arguing conquest. But remember, this is before the U.S. So it has to be the conqueror, and this was the colonists. It would have to have been Indians who participated in the twig and turf ceremony in order for it to be a lawful transfer, and it wasn't. So all of the treaties predating the U.S. still stand if the U.S. has not formalized any sort of agreement with those nations, and this is why the misclassification took place. This is why, as the U.S. goes west, the nations it meets and starts forcing them to sign treaties, and then eventually realizes even the treaties are too powerful, because the treaties are still showing that these are nations. And you don't want to deal nation to nation. You want to deal civilly with these, which are under your private laws. So you now pull a Snyder Act and you confer citizenship upon all of them, and now they're not separate nations anymore. They're your citizens, or you federally recognize them, in which case they become domestic dependents of you. Either way, not in a position to enforce any treaty rights. So when you look at what the whole concept of conquest is under international law, most of the tribes, definitely up in the Northeast and then going down into the Southeast and all that, before the U.S., was conquering, when you're talking colonial times, there was no lawful conquest, because no effective conquest, because they cannot point to any treaty they have with those nations. It's all still under whatever the treaties were that those nations had with the crown, which means whatever the language is that's in those treaties that they have with the crown, that's what they're subject. That's what you're subject to. And they don't want to be subject to that. They don't want to deal with you like you're a separate nation. So they've made everyone citizens so that you can't go ahead and argue, because you won't have the standing. So that is the point of everything that they've been doing to claim a lawful, an effective conquest of the land. Because if you're in your proper status, if you're operating through your private tribal trust, by your bloodline heritage that's been substantiated to predate the U.S., then you have a right to say to them, your conquest was never effective. Therefore, either you're going to abide by the laws of the treaties that were signed before you got here, or you're just going to be operating here unlawfully because you don't have any relationship with me. My relationship was with the British Crown. My relationship was with the French Crown. My relationship is with the who are you? U.S., federal, whoever. It's all about the effectiveness of the conquest. And they didn't properly do it in a lot of cases, especially on the East Coast, especially when you're talking pre-colonial. They did not effectively conquest. They threw us on the reservations and said that we were Negroes or Africans or whatever. They shipped us off into the Caribbean as slaves, but at no point did they sign any sort of contract with us that subjugated us and gave our lands to them. And once they realized this, they just said, well, we'll just say that they don't exist. Here comes the paper genocide. And once again, there's no one that has any standing to argue against an effective conquest. No one that has any standing to argue against an effective conquest. And if no one has any standing, then it doesn't matter what the facts are. You can't argue them in the eyes of the law. So this is the importance of substantiating that pre-colonial lineage. Because once you substantiate that pre-colonial lineage, you can then argue that the feds, whoever, are still beholden to those treaties, or argue that they don't have a relationship. In which case, if they don't have a relationship with your people at all, what authority do they have other than natural sort of common law sorts of things, a damage? Other than there's an actual damage going on, what is the jurisdiction? So it's all coming down to this effective conquest. And the way to challenge the effective conquest is to show that you were here beforehand and to question what the written sort of subjugation relationship is between them. Now, when you look at Mashipag, we're in the northern territories of Narragansett lands. In the northern lands of the Narragansett territories, and there was a political division in 1643, and the big chief up this way was a chief by the name of Pumham. He was in Shawamet, which is south of the Mashipag territories, on the borderlines between his issues with the chiefs from down in the southern southern regions. So since 1643, there was a separation politically, and the northern territories were not under any sort of subjugation or inferior position to the southern territories. Pumham died in 1676 fighting in Dedham Woods, and he died defending his lands. He never agreed to transfer his lands over, so therefore the argument that Mashipag was subjugated is a moot one. You have to go back to whatever treaties were involved and whatever treaties were overseen, because you can't show any other relationship you have or can harken back to with us other than those. And in those relationships, we are documented as being the superior entities in these lands, in the treaties that are taking place with the English crown. So, conquest and subjugation. The subjugation part includes a legal transfer of title. Not just a taking of the land, not just an annexation, but then a legal transfer. The Indians saying, here's our land. Not the Indians being shot and killed and forced on the reservations and misclassified. That's called genocide. That's called genocide, and you can't take someone's land through genocide. There had to be some sort of legal transfer, and in certain cases there were, but that's more out west. If you're talking southeast and northeast, you really want to look at what those treaty relationships were, and if there was relationships after them, and if your people are subject to them or not. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be known. But you won't be able to make any argument unless you first substantiated who your bloodlines are and that you are actually party to those treaties or ancestral to those lands. So that's it, just some ramblings. Conquest and subjugation is a very interesting topic. Please look further into it, because once again, this is how they're arguing they took these lands. But if you look at what effective conquest is, it seems like they just annexed it in a lot of situations and didn't properly subjugate, in which case it wasn't an effective conquest, and they're still beholden to the laws and agreements that were there before them that they inherited when they decided to break away from the crown. Hope that your day's going well. Many blessings to all of you that have been reaching out and sharing good comments in the comment section. stating that this information has been helpful to you in your personal journeys. That's definitely motivational. And peace ganache. I look forward to connecting with you all soon. The next time we've got some good information to share with you from the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. Aho.